here we have on this screen that picture, that first picture that we looked at that's on the first page of the chapter. And now, after spending 3 weeks with ozone and getting to know it a little bit better, I think that you can tell a story when you see this picture. And so the story is that there is ozone that's present in the stratosphere, and it's of benefit to us plants and animals living down on the earth, because it serves to screen out a portion of the ultraviolet spectrum that otherwise would not be screened by higher energy bonds such as oxygen and nitrogen. And so the ozone plays a real important role, even though it's a relatively unstable molecule. Because of the way the Earth has evolved and the atmosphere has evolved, there's some really neat chemistry that keeps the ozone concentration pretty much in a steady state, as long as nothing happens to disrupt that steady state. And so what this picture tells us is there's actually something going on here where the overall concentration of the ozone around the world is not constant, and down here around the South Pole, the Antarctic region, there's actually what's considered a hole. And now, it doesn't mean literally a hole, it just means a region of very low concentration relative to the rest of the world. And if you had a time-elapsed image of this image, which it is available online. If your teachers have access to Google, they could just Google hole in the ozone layer, and there's a nice little, or you can yourself, obviously, see a nice little video where it shows this hole getting smaller and bigger with the change in the seasons. But nevertheless, there's something definitely going on, and atmospheric scientists have recorded it, the concentration of ozone down here at the South Pole, and shown over time the concentration has decreased. And so that was a direct correlation with the increase in chlorine in the stratosphere. And so the culprit, the source of the chlorine, was found to be CFCs. About the time that they were introduced into the industrialized world on a large scale is when their concentration a couple years later started to elevate in the stratosphere, and at the same time the ozone concentration started changing. So this is a nice picture now, and so I hope that you can take some time to study it, and if you were asked, you could tell the story of this picture yourself to somebody else. Okay. Also, you should be mindful of the units, obviously, be able to explain the Dobson units. All right, so next up is the exam for this unit. It'll be exam number 3. And so I've just highlighted some bullet items that you should make sure you're familiar with as you're studying for this exam. Obviously, you need to know what ozone is, what it is, and where it's found. And then the skill that we had to develop to really understand the difference between ozone and oxygen was this ability to use Lewis symbols. So you need to be able to write all of the representative elements, the Lewis symbols, excuse me, of all the representative elements. And those, of course, are correlated with the periodic table. And the groups in the representative elements will tell you, the group number will tell you the number of valence electrons in those representative elements, and then you can use the Lewis symbol to model the numbers of electrons that are in the valence shell, or sometimes called valence shell, sometimes called valence level, sometimes called outer level. It's all the same thing. And you should also be mindful of some of the basics of the periodic table. That is the correlation between the group number and the number of valence electrons. The fact that the electrons are responsible, the outer electrons or the valence electrons are responsible for the chemistry of the elements, and so within a given group you're going to see similar chemical properties. All right, and then beyond that, you should be able to draw Lewis structures of some basic molecules. You had lots of practice on that, but the ability to recognize Lewis symbols as the valence shell of an element, of an atom, and then Lewis structures as the a way to predict and show what atom is connected to what atom within a molecule, and whether or not those atoms are linked through single, double, or triple bonds, or somewhere in between, which would indicate resonance. So all of the ins and outs of Lewis structures you should be familiar with, and you've had a lot of practice. You should be familiar with the different types and strengths of covalent bonds, single, double, triple, like I said, and the order of strength. Then the other sort of skill that we had to review to understand the job of ozone in the stratosphere were the properties of radiation. In this case, it's electromagnetic radiation, and you need to understand that they have both wave and particle-like properties. And then the wave, because they have wave-like properties, then we use the terms that you would use with waves to describe them. That is either the different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum can be described in terms of wavelength or in terms of frequency. And then when we start talking about the energy of those different wavelengths or those different frequencies, we talk about the photon. So we think of a photon as a small particle. It's massless, but it acts like a particle and or waves. And since they're all related, you need to be able to do some simple calculations where you convert wavelength to frequency or vice versa, and either of those to the energy of the photon. And of course, any constants will be given to you. Most people remember the speed of light is 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, but Planck's constant is a little bit not quite as easy of a number, so that would be given to you if needed. Okay, and then beyond sort of the basics, then once we had some clue about bonds and photons, then you can start having a more sophisticated concept of how electromagnetic radiation interacts with matter. And so since we have the concept of the photon and we can understand that different matter has different energy, and that energy could interact with matter in such a way to disrupt electrons out of bonds, so that then we could understand how oxygen and ozone can screen out ultraviolet radiation. We understood that the ultraviolet region of the spectrum varies from about 180 to 400 nanometers, and that it's broken down into 3 broad regions, A, B, and C. And C is the highest energy, and oxygen and ozone both screen out C, as do other atmospheric molecules. So C is not a problem in the troposphere. But B, because it's of lower energy, cannot break bonds, higher energy bonds such as in oxygen and nitrogen. But fortunately, B can be screened out by by ozone. So you should be familiar with, what the individual jobs of oxygen versus ozone. And so B, although it's of lower energy, it can still cause biological damage. So it's important to maintain a certain steady state concentration of ozone in the stratosphere. And this relationship between the ozone and the oxygen in the stratosphere is explained using the Chapman cycle. It's a steady state reaction where you see that the higher energy ultraviolet light breaks down the oxygen, and then the moderate energy ultraviolet light breaks the ozone into oxygen and an oxygen atom. And those 3 species, oxygen atom, oxygen molecule, and ozone, all interact with one another in a cycle called the Chapman cycle. So you should be familiar with that. The biological effects of ultraviolet radiation, we talked about those, so you should be, in general, familiar with the problems with having too much ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth, as far as causing skin cancer due to DNA damage. Extreme cases, it can actually break down the skin and cause a burn and blistering like any other type of burn. And also that it can inhibit plant growth and all the other things that we talked about. So just make sure you have a list of that and you're familiar with those biological effects. And then we need to recognize that ozone is, the Chapman cycle is disrupted, we call this natural ozone destruction, by molecules that are naturally found in the atmosphere to varying concentrations depending on the season and the winds and everything else. So we have some natural fluctuation and variation in that steady state cycle due to water and nitric oxide, sometimes referred to as nitrogen monoxide. The common name is nitric oxide, but nitrogen monoxide is probably how you know it. So you need to be familiar with what happens there with the disruption of the ozone, and then recognize that even though there are some, natural causes of fluctuations in the cycle, that those natural causes cannot account for the 8% decrease in the ozone concentration over the last 20, 30 years, and that it's been tied directly to CFCs and halons. We focus most of our time on CFCs just to tell a simple story, and this is the dominant cause, but halons also, in general, compounds that have bromine, chlorine, and fluorine. It's the bromine and the chlorine that cause problems, not the fluorine so much. So you need to be mindful of that, and then just read over the global response to the ozone destruction. Be familiar with, for example, the Montreal Protocol, or just that there were, big meetings that occurred and that people agreed on a global scale to do something about the problem. And then the result of all these meetings and recognition that there was human-made problems, then there obviously are replacements for CFCs, and you should be aware of that. So again, this test is going to be about 15 to 17 multiple choice questions, and then there will be a back page segment where I will ask you a short answer type question. Don't stress out over the short answer. As long as you have studied and have a basic idea of what's going on and can explain it, you should be fine. But for example, a short answer question here, just try to imagine what I could ask you. I could ask you to explain the picture that we've looked at over and over again. I could ask you to talk a little bit about, the global response to the ozone destruction, 4 or 5 sentences on that. Or I could ask you to talk about, in general, how the world has responded to this truly international, could have been crisis but was averted, that sort of thing. Just sort of your general take on this particular chapter.